Kia ora tātou katoa. Welcome to another week of Lunch Money brought to you by Shareises. At Shareises, our purpose is to create the most financially empowered generation.
Now, for those of you who are new to Lunch Money, we do these every Thursday at lunchtime. This is a place where you as investors can hear from the people leading some of the companies available on the Shareises platform, as well as other investing experts. And if you don't know who I am, which is probably all of you, my name is José. I am a video and podcast producer here at Shareises.
World famous from Recap, of course. We're super chuffed to have your face on here, José, that's for sure. And my name's Leighton, and I'm one of the co-founders at Shareises. Before we get in today's chat, we have a small legal disclaimer. So investing involves risk. You aren't guaranteed to make money, and you might lose the money you started with. Any information we provide is general only and current at the time that we say it. And if you're looking for help with your investment choices, we recommend talking to a licensed financial advice provider. We won't be providing any personalized advice as part of this webinar. So this week on Lunch Money, we are doing something a little bit different to what we usually do. And as you know, we quite often talk to the people running listed companies or experts on different markets. But we thought it might be useful to try focusing on different sectors as well, or different industries.
And we thought we'd start with electric cars, as more and more governments and companies are making bigger investments in the sector all the time, particularly over the last year doing Recap. There seems to have been a ton of investment. So if you're completely new to electric cars and what makes the industry tick, and you want to know what makes the industry tick rather, or if you're a bit like me, for example, and you just read up a bit, got your feet a little bit wet, this is Lunch Money for you.
Random stat, and I don't know if it's true, but I recently heard somewhere that Tesla Model 3s have just taken over from Toyota Hiluxes as the most purchased car in New Zealand. So honestly, I do not know if that's true or not, but if it is, that is a super interesting stat, and maybe today's expert will be able to help us with it. Anyway, regardless of how much you know about EVs, feel free to ask any questions you have through the Ask a Question button down below. Don't leave questions in the discussion area, as they're likely to get missed. Also, just please be kind and respectful towards our guests and your fellow viewers. Otherwise, we have to take steps to remove you from the webinar, and that's definitely not something we want to do.
And speaking of our guest today, we'll be talking to Erik Zydervelt. Erik is the co-founder and CEO of Mevo. Mevo is New Zealand's first electric and hybrid car share. Erik's done a lot of research on this about accelerating EV adoption and has some really interesting takes on where it's going, particularly when it comes to autonomous or self-driving vehicles. Welcome to Lunch Money, Erik.
Hey, great to be here, and thanks so much for having me.
Kia ora, Erik.
Hey, Leighton. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Let's get straight into it. First up, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah, of course. So I actually studied and grew up in Wellington for the last decade. But before that, my family was in California, and early life in Nelson. So moved out and studied urbanism. So how cities work. That was the big thing. And then in terms of tucking into professional life and applying it, I worked in strategy and had a couple of startups that didn't turn into much, which is pretty common, before having Mevo, which has really taken off. So that's been, a project with some great co-founders and an amazing team to apply that, like, not only how do cities work, but how do we make them as brilliant as they possibly can be. And when I'm not doing that, I just try to get into the mountains with my girlfriend and friends as much as possible.
Very, very cool. I love seeing the Mevo brand everywhere around now. We're quite regular customers, particularly from the airport. And I know there's a Mevo park right outside Sonia and Ben's place, so they're very lucky. But look, tell us a little bit more about Mevo, a bit about the company and what you're hoping and trying to achieve with it.
Yeah, well, I think a bit of broad background to lead into that. I've just been looking this week particularly at the New Zealand market, and in our 20 biggest cities, we have about 2.6 million light vehicles, so passenger vehicles. And it works out across the country to be roughly almost one vehicle per person, which is just nuts. So we're world leaders as a country, but probably not as we want to be in vehicle ownership. The crazy thing is those cars are used 4% of the time. That means they sit around 23 hours a day. And it's not that good. And they cost the country about $30 billion a year just for those 20 cities, which is nuts for something that's never used. So what Mevo does is kind of similar to the scooters that we see around the city. We provide individuals or organizations with access to those cars from their smartphone, so they can, reserve them, find them, unlock them, and drive them themselves for, be it 5 minutes, 5 hours, 5 days, whatever that looks like. But it replaces either like a private car, those cars that are sitting around being lazy, costing us lots of money, or a fleet of cars for an organization. So, you talked about government fleets going to electric. That's a perfect example. And what we see is whenever we deploy a car, put it out on the street, about 10 private cars are taken off the network. So people either choose not to buy, or they sell the car that they have. So whether they go to car free, or from a 2-car family to a 1-car family, that sort of thing. And we think that whole change from ownership to access is kind of inevitable. It's one of these things, I often like to ask people when I talk how many people have bought a DVD or CD in their life, and then ask them how many have in the last 6 months, and all the hands go down. No one has. They use Netflix, and that's the same thing. So we think that market, the access to mobility, in New Zealand easily could be you could build a well over $1 billion company, and that's what we're working to do.
Very cool.
Yeah, really cool indeed. So let's talk about electric cars. So electric transport seems to be just way more present over maybe even like the last 5 years. Electric scooters are sort of all over the footpaths. There's more options for buying electric cars. How far we're going is a matter of debate. What's kind of happened? What has had to happen to get us to this point where electric cars are increasingly becoming, as far as I can tell, viable?
Yeah, I mean, we'll try to keep it pretty simple. I know this is a 101, so there's noting, there'll be some listeners who probably have more background than we do, and there's endless levels of detail. But at a base level, it's, the technology is lithium-ion batteries, and massive amounts of development and investment around not only production, so increasing how much is available, but also how it's being used, and that's leading to some pretty crazy stats that we'll get into further down there. Accelerating that is government subsidies. So, we've seen the fee-bait, or what's sometimes called like a bonus malus scheme internationally, and that's been pretty awesome. Scandinavia and a bunch of other countries have just driven huge uptake, and we've just seen that same thing very recently in New Zealand with the clean car subsidy.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Like, is it Norway? They're almost, Sweden, I think. They're almost completely EV now.
I'm pretty sure I saw they reached 100% new car sales, or like an effective 100% new car sales. It was one of the Scandinavian countries in the last week or two.
Yeah, amazing.
So it's happening, and it's happening really fast.
And just as we're talking about it, I'm thinking like, what's the kind of, I'm assuming like different countries sort of, countries' obligations toward climate change and what's done sort of globally, that's driving as well. I mean, certainly here in New Zealand, that's a big thing, right?
Yeah, transport's about 20, give or take 20% of our emissions in New Zealand. We look a little different from a lot of developing country or developed countries because we have such an agricultural emissions profile, which looks more like a developing country than most OECD countries. But yeah, it's a big piece of the pie we need to solve.
Can you tell us a little bit about where they're all being made? Or those are huge stats, the ones you've just given out. Norway, and recently got back from Sydney. There was like the movement over there was larger than what, and since being back in Wellington actually, and probably the introduction of the scheme from the government, you can see a lot more around here as well. But they're getting made somewhere, right? Where's it happening? Where's the manufacturing bases? Yeah,
so I mean, there's the first part of the production chain. So like, mining lithium, because you're looking at about 10 to 15 kilograms of lithium per car. And so that's like Australia, Chile, China, Argentina. And that's set to like, I think I saw quintuple between 2020 and 2030. So big commodity markets there, and the supporting things around there. And then in terms of the vehicles themselves, I'm just going back to my notes. I know it's largely, we're seeing a lot in Europe, we're seeing a lot in North America, and then China, India coming through as well for the vehicle production.
And who are the big names? Some of them we obviously know, but maybe you can fill us in on where the, who's supplying all these cars in Norway? It can't just be one company.
Yeah, actually, just adding in, I left out Japan and Mexico are two of the other big hubs for production.
Right.
But I mean, some we know, some make a lot of sense to us in the Western world. So Tesla, no surprise there.
Mm-hmm.
Volkswagen Group, again, no surprise. BMW, Mercedes, Volvo. But then other ones that are coming out of the Asian bloc, so like SEAT, MG, Wuling, BYD is another really big one that's coming through. So yeah, some existing that we expect and some new that we're not so familiar with.
Maybe this is a bit of a, I don't know if you can 100% answer this, but a little bit of a crystal ball gazing question, but does the possibility exist for smaller car makers to exist? Or, will the big traditional automakers like the Fords or the GMs kind of engulf anything? I'm sort of thinking like, as an analogous, maybe, Apple, for example,
Yeah, I mean, there's been lots of change in this. I think to address that, it's probably good to go back a little bit and recognize that there was a big period. It was decades in the US market where there hadn't been a successful new entrant to the market. And, most famously, DeLorean, think Back to the Future, had a really big attempt, raised a bunch of money, invested a lot into launching a new car brand and failed pretty famously for a number of reasons. So that was the way cars were being made hasn't really changed much in the last 100 years since they first started hitting the market. Roughly an engine, a transmission, a drivetrain. Whereas this change is the first time they've been redesigned, and it's a little bit like the digital camera, the move from film to digital. You see some existing, incumbents really evolve and learn and invest and change. And you see some that get stuck in what's often referred to as like the innovator's dilemma, where they just keep investing in their known model instead of new models. And that's why they end up failing. And so like with the camera analogy, Canon, yep, they're still around. New entrants like Instagram's a photography brand. That's pretty crazy. They didn't exist when there was film. And Kodak, one of the biggest ones, is gone. And I suspect we'll see the same sort of thing in electric vehicles. So, there's some big existing Volkswagen Group, BMW, Mercedes-Benz on that list. But Tesla didn't exist really a decade ago in any material way. And you're seeing like Lucid Air or a bunch of other, Rivian is another example, the truck maker that's just electric truck maker just coming into the market. So, and that's only speaking in the current form factor. So the, 4 to 5 seater current types of vehicles we're used to seeing. It's quite crazy when you look at production. So 2015, there were around 1 million electric vehicles on the market of the normal kind of car type. Last year, that jumped up to 11 million. So that's more than a order of magnitude growth in a decade, right? Less than in 5 years, sorry. So you go, if it keeps going at that pace, is it going to keep going there, or is it accelerating, which is usually what we're expecting to see? That's 100 million a year. That starts to grow really fast. But the crazy thing, and I mean, that's a bit of a mind-blowing one, but the one that always gets me is we're looking at 11 million kind of battery electric vehicles in the car type right now, but there's 260 2- and 3-wheel electric vehicles. So like e-bikes are outpacing vehicle production. We see scooters everywhere. Ubco is a great example of a New Zealand company that's doing really well making electric farm bikes. Brilliant, and they're just ramping up rapidly. So we're seeing not only a change of our existing car type from internal combustion to battery, but we're also seeing this like myriad of form factor change, which is really cool.
So what I'm sort of taking from that is that, there probably is a place for, the smaller car makers to exist, rather than like sort of, 4 or 5 big guys really, developing the whole industry.
Yeah, I think we'll probably see a lot new entrants, and then in time you'll start to see consolidation as well. So those new entrants will, most markets will often go wide and then consolidate and then go wide. And we saw, in the petrol market in New Zealand retailing, that has happened and gone through different cycles over time too.
When we talked earlier in the week, and you were just talking about the sort of form factor changing, the sort of, this is like the only time kind of since cars were created that they've really kind of changed. And you used to refer to, electric car as now like it's basically a cell phone, which really turned the dial in my brain a little bit. Could you unpack that a little bit and what the kind of implications of looking at a car like that is?
Yeah, I guess if I think back to when I was a kid, I had a little go-kart with a 250 motorbike engine built into it, right? So it's this mechanical, oily, greasy thing with cogs and gears and chains and stuff, right? And that's cars were getting smarter and smarter, but that's largely, they still have a gearbox and so on and so forth. With electric cars, they are basically a cell phone. They're a computer on wheels, right? You've got a big battery pack similar to your iPhone, stacked up battery cells connected to controllers being, basically your laptop. And then electric motors, which are pretty small and kind of like crazy efficient in terms of converting electricity into power, like nuts when you compare them to how efficient a petrol car is. But you jump in a Model 3 and all the user experience, the layout of the screens and stuff, the toggle buttons are the same as on your iPhone, like the thing's an iPhone on wheels compared to this mechanical, oily thing with gears and cogs and whatnot. And don't get me wrong, both are fun, but yeah, just completely different beasts.
Yeah, and that kind of has implications that we'll talk on a little bit later, and certainly when we get to autonomous cars and kind of the sort of Internet of Things.
Yeah, I went for my first drive in a Tesla recently, and it was like it was a little bit like a souped up golf cart, like the simplicity of the, everything around it and just the iPad in the middle. But yeah, it is amazing what those motors can do. It's sort of quite trippy, the foot on, foot off type feeling of the accelerator. But well, I guess it'll all be normal soon enough. Let's talk about the environmental aspects, and we've already covered a lot of that anyway. But battery specifically is one you hear a lot about, and they're obviously pretty key to an electric car. So could you just go through what's involved in their production? You already touched on the mining and stuff of the lithium, but just really interested in the disposal of them as well.
I think, look, I mean, I'll be upfront in terms of the nitty gritty technical details of battery manufacturing and value chain supply and things like that. Like there are certainly people who know more about this space than me. But you look at the mining conflicts that have come up in Chile, which is one of the big lithium producing countries in the world. Just some pretty massive. You're pumping just enormous amounts of water through these salt beds, and then you have these fields of evaporation ponds where the lithium's purified. It's pretty crazy. And when you look at how many vehicles we have on the road globally, I'll just get to the number. It's 1.4 billion vehicles on the road globally. The idea of converting all of those one for one from a petrol car to an electric car is pretty nuts when you think about each electric car. That's 15 tons of emissions to produce. And yeah, it is lower than petrol cars. I'm not advocating that electric cars we shouldn't go that way. We absolutely should. We just need less of them. And the one for one transition is pretty crazy. The other part that comes into this is what's termed as often a cradle to grave value chain, or supply chain, where you mine the raw materials out of the ground, you make batteries, you make cars, you put them on the road, they have a life, and then they die. And I think I saw 2 to 3% of lithium ion batteries in Australia right now actually get recycled. The rest go to landfill. cars will be better because they're concentrated, which will enable that. And you see things like the batteries being reused for large grid scale storage after the fact. I think we'll see lots of that. But still, it's one of those things. We need to be shifting to circular economy as much as we possibly can. So the idea of having as much as we can made out of organic material, which we can biodegrade. So that's an organic cycle. And then the other cycle being a technical cycle. So battery electric vehicles do provide a good opportunity for us to test that out, but it's not bedded in yet at all.
So what is your view then on the sustainability? And I mean, I guess you've spoken to your own business model a little bit there and just reducing the quantity of cars on the road, but just your take on the overall environmental cost of the EVs that we have now.
Yeah, I think it's one of these things. We need to be really, as an economy, as regulators, as a society, we need to be really well aware of what's referred to as full life cycle analysis. So everything from the mining through to the disposal and everything in between, and the impacts that have. Look, I'm not saying we should stay with petrol cars. That's crazy. But I think it's the sheer reality and probably having the maturity that things don't go away. It's, away doesn't exist. It's a landfill, which in Wellington, we all know where it is, right? That should be a beautiful valley full of native birds, and instead it's something pretty gross. Mm-hmm. So saying these cars are being produced, there are real world impacts, and we need to minimize those as much as possible, and then, mitigate those as much as possible. So having $30 billion a year worth of cars in New Zealand that sit around 23 hours a day is nuts. It's just crazy. And electric cars will play a big part of that future. And there's some other cool stuff going on too. E-bikes are brilliant, and hydrogen for heavy transport. Mm-hmm.
We've lost you, José.
Oh no.
Still lost you.
You're the quietest I've ever seen you.
Oh, that's because I turned my mic off.
Oh,
that'll be it. Was grumbling.
That could. I've heard that has that effect from time to time.
Yeah, if you turn your mic off, absolutely. Apologies for that. I was just going to say that. So that brings us to a couple of questions. We had a number of questions coming in sort of about the impact, moving on from the sort of environmental impact, and the impact that if we still start moving to EVs and what that might have on energy networks. I think one of the people who was asking questions, Stuart, in New Zealand, will the power network be able to provide enough green energy to power the fleet? Stuart was asking, surely at some point the EV will need to pay road user charges. Will this make the money? So kind of two questions there, really.
Yeah, there's a bit in that. So I mean, again, I'll note there's people who know a lot more about the energy grid in New Zealand than me, but I think we can be clear that today, with very few EVs on the fleet, relatively speaking, we don't have enough green energy to run our grid through the peaks, particularly through the year. So this government's committed to reaching 100% sustainable or renewable grid, and then they use a piece of clever language during a normal climatic year. We don't really have many of those coming up. The climate's changing pretty quick. So the first major step is increasing the amount of renewable generation. The other major part is going to be storage, so that we can manage the supply through those peaks. And there's some big grid scale storage projects. Batteries is what I mean, like really big battery farms to hold power for when everyone gets home on a July evening and turns their kettle and dishwasher and dryer on all at the same time, and their heaters, because it's bloody cold outside, right? We all know those nights. So first, more renewable generation and getting rid of our old, normally it's called thermal generation. And then the second part is more storage. So grid scale batteries and other smarts we can do. That's just to deal with energy today. And then there's the increase of battery electric cars. There's some cool opportunities with using the cars as that storage. So, it's called for short V2G, or vehicle to grid, but that technology is still developing to a point where it's like consumer ready.
Yeah. And what about hydrogen? I know that will come up. You mentioned it just briefly before. Heavy loads. I mean, is that a contender as far as you know? I mean, what is? I'm not going to ask. Well, what even is hydrogen? I still don't actually understand it, to be honest.
I mean, again, hydrogen's pretty much just storage, right? So you can produce hydrogen using energy. It's not a great conversion rate from energy to hydrogen that can then be released, but it's really good for, in New Zealand case at least, from what we're seeing, it's good for heavy transport, so trucks and things like that. And there's some cool projects. So there's a company, Haringa Energy, which is setting up hydrogen for like ports and large industrial users. In other countries, they might go more down the hydrogen route than the battery electric route for different reasons existing with their grid and their environment. But it's looking like electric for light vehicles and hydrogen for heavy vehicles in New Zealand right now. Things could change though.
Nice. So I guess you're passing over to me there, José, were you?
Sorry. Yeah.
No, that's all good. I was just thinking about what you said. So what are the types of innovations you think are coming up? Like, one of them we know about, one that sort of happened in that when I was in that Tesla the other day was the autonomous stuff and actually being driven around by cars. So where's all that at?
Well, I think this is the thing with, if we jump back to the earlier conversation around this massive increase in electric vehicles, and that means a massive increase in connected vehicles because they're all pretty much cell phones on wheels, right? And then we go, well, we look at cell phones and computers and computing power. So, the cost of processing power in a chip is dropping, and the cost is dropping and the amount is increasing pretty rapidly. And the rate that grows is, just absolutely crazy. It's known as Moore's law. With that, you have the advent of things like autonomous driving, which is coming along. You've got different approaches. So a lot of manufacturers are kind of leaning quite heavily on what's called LiDAR, which is basically technology that shoots little lasers in every direction and builds a 3D model of the world around it that's constantly being updated. And it's really cool, but it's expensive comparative to vision. So the idea that you can just have cameras that see the world around it and can drive a car from that. So, I mean, it's kind of like you could make the argument it's a little bit like you could drive a car without ABS braking, but ABS braking makes it safer, right? So Volkswagen Group, as an example, is leaning heavily on LiDARs. Tesla, as an example, is leaning heavily on vision only. And there's arguments both ways. But again, it comes back to this: if they're all connected, the transaction cost of moving to an access economy over an ownership economy becomes really low. So if you think about, Leighton, you're in Wellington a bunch, and if we didn't have Mevo as a technology and as a operator in the city, for you and I to share a car, we'd have to get on the phone and be like, hey, do you need the car this weekend? When should I meet you? Do you want to grab a coffee? I'll give you the keys. It's a really high cost of transaction. Don't get me wrong. Coffee with you sounds great. But it's not feasible for I'm going to get up at 3 a.m. and run my kid to the emergency room, whereas if you've got a technology that makes the transaction really easy to access instead of ownership, and it's Netflix is a great example. They used to send out DVDs because they saw that technology curve was improving rapidly, and they went, if we're ahead of the market and have the people using us, even if it's DVDs in the mail, when that technology, the underlying technology really, hits mass market, we'll be a step ahead. And so with autonomous vehicles or connected vehicles, which is what, all of the connected part, all of our vehicles on the Mevo network are, that transaction cost is viable. And then comparing it to ownership is nonsensible. Owning a car that sits around 23 hours of the day is just not sensible. Or for organizations having, think about DHBs. We've all probably been to the hospital and just seen the rows and rows and rows of Suzuki Swifts just sitting there on the weekend because they're not being used. And then you've got a bunch of nurses and doctors who can't find a park close to their work. It's a real problem we're working to solve. So I think autonomous driving only accelerates that change.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you've talked about that kind of innovations and that kind of the autonomous self-driving thing is like the big thing everyone's pushing to in the immediate future. What are the challenges though for the industry, like the immediate challenges? What are the next problems that the industry will need to overcome?
Well, there's some crazy stuff happening right now just in global supply. So, we talked about the processing power of those computers on wheels, right? That means they need chips. But as that's happening and, everything in the world is becoming connected, that means everything in the world needs chips. So we've got this global chip shortage that's happening right now. And that's slowing down production. So I know there's one model of vehicle that's being held up because the smart key needs a chip in it, and there's just no chips to put in the cars. So that's a major one. There's other sort of kind of second and third tier impacts of COVID and the pandemic. A lot of the plant used for distribution. So we're talking about big ships and whatnot. People the experts who do the safety testing on those ships just haven't been able to get into, Singapore, where a lot of that happens. So there's all these kind of crazy, almost like, butterfly effect things that are coming into the world where we're like, oh God, how do we solve that? So like for Mevo, we're waiting on a giant shipment of cars to continue to grow the company. And they'll get made. We just need the chips to come through. That's probably the major kind of really immediate one. But then coming back, climate change, we've got this massive challenge we're trying to solve. And just turning 1.4 billion petrol vehicles into 1.4 or more billion battery electric vehicles. It's a death sentence for humanity and everyone's grandkids. We just simply can't do that. So changing the environmental impacts of our transportation system is just so hugely important.
Yeah, coming back to the semiconductor thing, it sort of blows my mind how, a lot of that is the shortage of semiconductor chips, and it is affecting just about everything. But the sort of blows my mind that, and we've talked a bit about this on Recap, which you should subscribe to. It's the shortages are due obviously to COVID and all those reasons you'll see, but also it's just kind of like a supply and demand thing. COVID hits, the car makers go, oh, we're going to cut back on our production and cancel their orders from overseas for their chips. The people that make the chips overseas go, oh, okay, and then move to production to produce chips for electronic goods because there's still demand for that because you can order them online. And then when COVID lessens the pandemic, everything starts opening up a little bit more. The car makers go, we want our chips now, and the makers are going, well, we're just making them for electronic goods now, and so everyone's going, and that just every time I think about it, how fragile that supply chain is. There's also political stuff going in, so we're seeing consistent supply from Chinese manufacturers, where a lot of the chips are made, but then the vehicles that are made in China are able to access those chips, whereas others aren't. It's a fascinating space to watch. And that sort of brings us kind of to timeframes for the big changeover. There's a question from Gohan here who says, when do you think the tipping point will be when buying a new petrol-driven car will really be a bad idea come resale time 3 or 4 years later? So is there any consensus around when I might look out my window and just hear the purr of electric motors and nothing else?
There's some moving parts to this question. I think the simplest answer is looking at price parity. When someone is going to go buy, in the States, say a Ford F-150 truck, which is like us in the Hilux, right? And instead, for the same or cheaper price, they can buy an electric version of that. That's when you see that really big shift. And so a lot of countries have introduced subsidies to help make that happen, to drop the price of petrol or electric cars and increase the price of petrol cars. And so the bonus malus or fee-bait version of that. I mean, things have been moving around with the pandemic, but for some of the higher priced models, you're kind of expecting to see that 24, 25, 26. So coming up pretty quickly. But then it's also a supply demand. So, going, well, if we've gone from 1 million to 11 million in 5 years and then 100 million, the more the supply comes through, the cheaper it gets. That's another big part. But then there's this shifting global space around the entirety of vehicle production. So we saw highs of vehicle production, about 94 million globally in 2017. And that had been on a 4-year decline to about 76.5 million in 2020. This year's looking really strong compared to previous years, but when you go accelerating BEVs, that's happening. Price parity is coming through, and you've got these other two big shifts that's around, access instead of ownership, which has an order of magnitude reduction. So, if I told you we had 100 cars working in Wellington on the Mevo fleet, they'd be doing 1,100 cars worth of work. That means those cars have been displaced. And couple that with the change of form factor. So companies like new entrants like Nimbus, micro scooters are making, these little teeny battery electric cars. So 2 seats, 200K range, sub $10,000 price tag. That's just going to throw everything on its head, I think, as well. So yeah, I'd say we'll be living in a very, very different world by 2030.
Nice, thanks. Just looking at the time, we might just ask a couple of quick fire questions so we can get them with that. These ones are Mevo related as well, actually. So awesome. Grant just asked, eventually Tesla hope to have full self-driving sanctioned by the US auto regulators. Do you think New Zealand transport regulators will ever allow it to? And secondly, will you be adding any Teslas to your fleet in Wellington soon?
Good question. So I know a lot of the regulators in this space in New Zealand, and they're working pretty quickly. It's a really complex problem to solve. I think the first major step is just getting a trial on the road. So Omeo is a New Zealand autonomous vehicle company. And they're the only company in Korea that's been approved to operate on the roads. So South Korea, obviously, and they're doing some really cool stuff. And they're working closely with New Zealand regulators to get a pilot up and running on public roads. That's going to be the first step, and then rolling it through. That being said, there's things like driver assist. People often think of this, Johnny Cab. I don't know if you'd call it a utopia, but we'll run with that. Complete, get in the car, don't touch anything other than saying where you're going. It's not ever going to be as simple as an A/B change to that. We're seeing cars that just nudge you back into your lanes, and we've got a bunch of Teslas driving around with autopilot running, which is really more driver assist. It's kind of like having a 4-year-old drive your car. They do a really good job most of the time, but you got to keep an eye on it.
You must have a different 4-year-old. I'm thinking maybe an 8-year-old.
Yeah, all right. Eight's probably good. It's still super impressive. Don't get me wrong. Just not. It's not into that place. But the second part of that question, we have some cool announcements coming up pretty soon. So I won't give anything away, but we're working closely with ECA, the government agency that's designed to help do a bunch of great things, but get more electric vehicles out on the road is one of their major focuses. And so we're launching 120 battery electric vehicles in the near future. And we should be announcing the first few, which will be hitting the road soon. So watch this space.
Very cool. I've got a good question here from Joshua just come in. With the evident proliferation of EVs, how do you think the landscape of society will change as a result? I think you've sort of talked about that. Will there need to be a need to create large EV car park charging stations in the middle of the city or even across the country? And that's interesting because the sort of charging infrastructure is touched on.
I think when it comes to charging, there's two different areas that you really want to look at, which is, well, you could argue 3. So there's at home, kind of trickle charging, which can happen in your garage or when you're at a supermarket or things like that. AC charging is often what it's referred to. And that, you think of that like your cell phone, plug it in at night, let it charge overnight, maybe plug it in when you're sitting at your desk for a while, those sorts of things. And then there's rapid charging or on-the-go charging. So more traditional or more aligned to like going to the petrol station, filling up. Takes a little bit longer, but that's getting faster and faster and faster. So yeah, absolutely. In key spots, like, if you're driving through Tie Happy as an example, right? Like that's a great spot for a rapid charger. Same as a great spot for a petrol station. And there's lots of research and thinking going into that. But then most of the charging, a lot more of it, the majority will happen at work, at home, at the supermarket, and be a bit slower.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Just noting the time, I think we've just about run out of time, actually, which is a pity because I could talk about this all day.
I was just thinking like on the autonomous thing, but I was like, what's the next industry that comes out of that? And I was like, who's going to clean the cars if the cars are driving around themselves? So if anyone wants to,
we think a lot. Yeah, we think a lot about. So we've got a pretty incredible operations team, and I'm looking at a couple of them in the office now. But we think a lot about that being similar to like the Amazon Web Services for the internet, but for mobility. There's this whole operational value layer that's just going to keep the city mobility running. And I know Wellington Airport, when they built their car park, they thought about that car park as a hub for autonomous vehicles to charge and be cleaned and all of that in the future. And that's one of the ways they justified a future risk of a car park, which is kind of nuts, eh?
The microservices of transport. Yeah, cool. Anyway, sorry, José.
Yeah. No, that was great. That was a good question. It was awesome. Hey, thank you so much, Erik, and thanks to everybody for tuning in today. Been a really good chat. As I say, Erik, we really enjoy your time and your insights. As we said at the top of the show, this is a little bit of a trial. Let us know if you'd like to see more episodes of Lunch Money that are like this. If so, what industry or fields would you like to see us cover? Just let us know, and we'll look at it.
Definitely.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
No,
awesome. And thanks for everyone for tuning in and the great questions.
Thanks, Erik, and best of luck with everything Mevo related. It's some really great things. And like I say, definitely enjoy using the service myself. So big ups and looking forward to hearing your announcements that you mentioned are coming up in the breaking news section earlier.
Yeah, awesome.
Next Thursday, our guest is Mark England. He is the CEO of Genesis Energy. He'll be giving us an overview of Genesis and their financial performance, their work on sustainability, and what the future holds for the company. So a super interesting follow-up to today's session. You can register for that through the link in the chat.
We'll see you next Thursday. Enjoy the rest of your week and stay safe. Mā te wā.